All right. Hello, Interfaith America viewers. I'm so excited to be here today with Antonio, who is the Latino Outreach Specialist for Yolo County in California. And he's also a congressional staffer in the US House of Representatives. And Antonio, really, his story has stood out to me because he has been working for and with and alongside farm workers, especially during this period of COVID. So I'm so excited, Antonio, to have you here and just to hear more about your work. And I'll hand it over to you. If you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and how you came to this work with farm workers.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. My name's Antonio, and as you mentioned, I've been working with farm worker communities through the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm in my home area of Yolo County, California. For those of you who don't know, that's kind of immediately west of Sacramento, east of the Napa Valley region, so kind of northern Central Valley in rural California. So we have a big farm worker community, always have. I always say I don't remember learning about farm workers for as long as I kind of am aware of my existence. I knew farm workers existed too. My grandpa was actually a bracero farm worker towards the end of World War II. So it's in my family, like it is in so many different Mexican-American families. Our story in this country kind of starts with working in the fields, and that tradition continues today with farm workers are overwhelmingly Latino. I think the latest National Agricultural Worker Survey that USDA did, it says that it's probably between 80 to 90% Latino, more than 60% Mexican origin, and of those, probably around half are undocumented. So it's a big Latino population, immigrant population, and unfortunately during COVID-19, they've been not just among the most essential workers, but also among the most vulnerable. So you can't pick tomatoes over Zoom. It's a job that requires you to be there in person. And as a result, some of the COVID outcomes for farm workers have been really, really horrific, with folks getting sick on the job, folks dying on the job. I think our current farm worker population has other vulnerabilities. It's actually an older population than I think a lot of folks realize. The average age for a farm worker in the United States is actually 45, but it's not uncommon to know, I know folks who are, 62, 63, 60, 65 even, who are, still working in the fields. It obviously is a job that does not pay as well as I think it should. A lot of farm worker communities live in poverty. In Yolo County, food insecurity has been a consistent issue among farm workers, which is double ironic when you consider that these are the same folks who are actually feeding the nation, feeding the world, and then they're going hungry themselves. So there's a lot of issues there, a lot of history there too, right? The Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. This has been a community that different generations of activists have tried to organize and mobilize to fight for better conditions. And there's definitely some real accomplishments in that history. But at the same time, I think in some ways the conditions today can be just as bad as they were back in the 60s or the 30s. So definitely a lot of attention that needs to be paid. And I think if there's one silver lining to COVID, it's that it has increased kind of the visibility of farm worker issues in this country, where folks have really realized, okay, like these are the people who are actually feeding us. Society can work without a lot of people doing their jobs, right? I don't think I'm essential in any real way, but it can't work without farm workers. So I hope that out of all this horror, we can maybe get renewed attention to the issue of labor rights and immigrant rights, and just general economic and racial justice for America's agricultural workforce.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for sharing your personal story of being the grandson of a bracero farm worker. And now to see you doing this work is just truly inspiring. You mentioned the issues that farm workers face, and one line that really stuck out to me is when you said, we can't pick tomatoes over Zoom. And that's so true. And so what were some of the conversations like when COVID first hit Yolo County, or was hitting these communities of farm workers? What kinds of conversations were they having about whether or not to return to work, and were any policies put in place to keep them safe?
Yeah, so I think that's like it varied, but for the most part, like when COVID hit, I think, immediately we started going on these kind of the real somewhat shut down orders, where folks were told to stay at home. This was early in the pandemic. There was a lot of stuff we still didn't understand around masks and things like that. Certainly, vaccines were nowhere on the horizon at the time. Um, but even in the midst of that, the county and the state and even the Department of Homeland Security would put out directives essentially saying, all right, these are the sectors that are considered essential, and that's where this term that has now become a buzzword comes from. Is these were the folks who were told, all right, like even if everyone else is staying home and sheltering in place, you're essential, you should come to work. And agriculture was there, and for Yolo County, agriculture is a huge industry. We're one of the leading national producers of tomatoes, also almonds, rice are some of our other major crops. And so there was never really a discussion of farm workers not coming to work. Then there were pretty early on, I think, a lot of voices that were saying, all right, this is a community that's going to be pretty hard hit as a result of this, and we need to be considering what that means. I wrote an op-ed in the Sacramento Bee, right at the start, essentially saying, like, this is going to hit farm workers hard, building on all the existing issues that have been ignored for too long. There were recommendations put out by some very smart folks. At UC Davis, which is in Yolo County, the Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety, I think by the second month had really kind of concrete recommendations around distancing. Employers should be providing masks and protective gear. The issue, I think, has been that those safety recommendations are just recommendations for the most part. The Trump administration definitely did not try to implement any comprehensive safety regulations, and even in the state of California, which did, in theory, put some safety regulations, enforcement was essentially non-existent, right? So, and then you add on top of that, this is a community where, again, there's high levels of undocumented folks, a lot of language barriers, cultural barriers. This is just not a community that's, I think, used to thinking of government as a solution to their problems. And so that, combined with the fact that I think a lot of agricultural employers resent kind of government interference, I think led to it being a kind of a functionally optional requirement. So some farmers did the right thing, and I commend them for that, and took it really seriously, and have been working with the local government and others to try to protect their workers, and other employers didn't. And I think that's something that in some cases did cost lives, and that's something that personally makes me upset, and I think should make everyone upset.
Yeah, I agree. It should outrage all of us. Okay, so now we're in February, end of February, going into March, and vaccines are rolling out across the country. Are farm workers accessing these vaccines? I know that you've been working in a vaccination clinic. Can you speak a little bit to the access for farm workers to these vaccines?
Yeah, so I think, again, it's kind of a patchwork system. In Yolo County, we're very proud that we've been vaccinating farm workers now for 2 weeks. We vaccinated over 1,000 farm workers, which is actually, we're a pretty small rural community, so we only have around probably 7,000 farm workers. It's kind of a hard population to track, but that's our best estimate. So if you take that as a given, then we vaccinated probably 1 out of 7 of the farm workers in the county. I think there is a little bit of a time crunch for us because the work season begins in earnest kind of in the spring with the planting, and then kind of picks up through the summer, peaking, in July and August with the tomato harvest. And as part of that, we have a big migrant farm worker population that returns to Yolo County from South Texas and from Mexico, where we know that, I mean, the spread's pretty bad in California, but community spread's even worse in South Texas. I think it's the worst place in the country. So definitely concerned about what folks coming from there might be bringing to the farm workers who are here year round, when they're sharing, they're carpooling, it's cramped housing conditions, they're working, in close proximity, and even if they are outdoors for the most part. So I think there's a lot of, there's a time crunch to try to get folks vaccinated before the work season begins in earnest. And I think Yolo County is doing that. Other places in California are doing that. I believe Riverside County in the Coachella Valley, working with community orgs, was the first that I'm aware of to vaccinate farm workers in California. But then other states, it's a very different situation, right? Texas and Florida, for example, both have large farm worker populations that have not been prioritized in any meaningful way. The CDC does recommend that farm workers be prioritized. So that is kind of the federal guidance. But again, I think it's not necessarily followed through by all the different state and local, health departments across the country. So I think as with everything in this pandemic, it's become a very patchwork system where, this place requires masks, this place doesn't, this place is vaccinating teachers and farm workers, this place isn't. So
Right.
it's kind of a mixed bag, but I think it's certainly for us, it's been, I think, part of the racial equity issue of the vaccine rollout, making sure that this largely, overwhelmingly Latino population that's really at risk gets prioritized, is also part of, making sure that Latino communities are protected from the vaccine. And in California, Latinos have had, really bad, disproportionate outcomes in terms of our percentage of the population versus our percentage to COVID cases, and now our underrepresentation in vaccination rates.
Right. Yeah, 1,000 distributed vaccines is pretty remarkable. And I hope that number continues to increase. But yeah, you spoke to so many important issues, one of them being how communities of color and Latino communities have been so disproportionately impacted by COVID and left out of the relief process. And I hope that that's something that we learn from and that we grow from. So this conversation is so amazing. And I know that a lot of our readers will want to act, will want to do something. And so are there pieces of legislation that we can champion or advocate for, or specific organizations that are supporting farm workers? How can we get involved in supporting farm workers?
I think that's a great question. I think there's a lot of different orgs. I mean, the main one I'd say in California is the United Farm Workers, right? Going back to the Cesar Chavez movement, there's also the UFW Foundation. They've been really key in helping get farm workers vaccinated. They're actually helping run some of the clinics in Fresno County and other places in California. Across the country, there's different groups. Farm Worker Justice is kind of the main group based in DC that does the advocacy legislatively for what the kind of policy solutions for farm workers might be. I think right now in the House of Representatives, there's the Senator Alex Padilla of California, Congressman Castro of Texas, Senator Warren of Massachusetts, and Ted Lieu of California are introducing the Citizenship for Essential Workers Act, which I think is, kind of the bare minimum, is just the idea of, farm workers, meat packers, all these other essential workers who, overwhelmingly, there's 5 million undocumented essential workers, in health, not just agriculture, but healthcare, transportation, service workers who have been on the front lines of this pandemic, can't work from home, and have paid a really high price. And, I think it's one of those, for farm workers, I say, if you feed America, you should get the right to stay in America. And clearly we can't do it without them. That's what we're saying when we call them essential and make them come to work in a pandemic, is we're saying, look, we can't do this without you. And I think it's time to take that to its logical step. Fine, farm workers are essential. That means let's protect them and let's give them citizenship, and let's extend labor rights. There's so many issues with farm workers. I could talk about this all day, but I think that really seeing this as a moment where farm workers have proven their worth and their importance to our society, and thinking just what that debt means, right? All of us who have food on our tables have a debt, I think, to the folks who the hands that literally pick those crops or pack that meat in the I know you're from Mississippi, and poultry plant workers in the South are very much similar situation of, again, these are the workers who are feeding us, and we really treat them shamefully. And if ever there was a wake-up call, I think it's got to be COVID-19.
Yeah. What you said of, if you feed America, you should have the right to stay in America, just like that times 100. And I think for all of us, like anything that touches our plate was most likely touched or packaged or prepared by the hands of migrants. And yes, they should have full rights and liberties in this country. And I hope that that happens under this new administration. And we got to keep pushing for it.
Yeah, for sure.
So that kind of leads to this question for you, as someone who has like been in proximity and been living with these communities for so long. What is your vision for the future of farm workers in America? I know that's a small little question.
I think it's I mean, I think really it's about just taking their rightful place kind of in the, you know, in the pantheon of American heroes. You know, I hope that I think, you know, if you think about American history, American agriculture has always depended on, you know, a racialized, you know, disenfranchised labor force, right? I mean, when you think about when the New Deal labor laws were written, agriculture was excluded. So to this day, in most of the country, farm workers don't have the same labor rights to, you know, collectively bargain or organize a union, or, you know, overtime pay that most other industries have. That was, you know, a specifically racist decision that was done in the 1930s to exclude what at the time was predominantly, you know, Black sharecroppers in the South, and then, you know, Latino and Asian immigrant workers in the West. We essentially said, okay, we're not going to extend the same labor rights to these workers like we would to, you know, a white, you know, Ford factory assembly line worker in Detroit. And those inequalities have persisted to this day. So I'd say in some ways, our agricultural labor laws are one of the last, you know, real remaining remnants of Jim Crow that are still on the books in the US. So I think of that history as really the fact that the farm worker story, I think, is more central to the American story of land and race, and, you know, democracy and who gets to participate in it than we think. It's certainly central to the Latino story in America. And I guess my vision for farm workers is just as part of a broader, you know, we need to have a multiracial social democracy, right? Like we need to have a democracy that fully includes everyone. You know, with immigration reform being, I think, would be the biggest expansion of voting rights since the 1960s and the biggest expansion of labor rights since the 1930s. And we need to have a social safety net that can take care of folks. I think justice for farm workers needs to be part of ending hunger in America, both to ensure that the workers who feed us aren't going hungry, and also to ensure that the workers who are feeding everyone else are treated with dignity and respect and with really just what they deserve. It's hard work. You know, it's long hours. It's hard on your back. It's hard on your knees. It's hard on your hands. You know, through the heat of the summer, the fires and the smoke in California, through the rain of the winter, and now through the pandemic, farm workers have worked through it all. And I think there is a debt there that we need to pay.
Right. Yes. Farm workers are American heroes and should be treated as so. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do. You are truly an inspiration, and we're sending a giant wave of gratitude to all the farm workers that keep us nourished and keep us fed and keep us alive. And my final question for you is, if you have one piece of wisdom or a quote or just a practice that you have that keeps you sustained in this really difficult and at times heartbreaking work. So what is that piece of wisdom?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think of it as heartbreaking. I mean, there's like hard stuff for sure, but I just really enjoy being able to be there with what I feel is my community. Farm workers, you know, are the nicest, kindest folks you'll ever meet. You know, if you want a classic piece of farm worker literature, you know, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. I think there's I forget the quote exactly, but there's something there about, you know, if you need help in this world, go to the poor. And I remember a lot, you know, we started doing testing at the migrant farm worker camps last summer, and it became a thing where every time we would do it, the farm workers would like bring us like tomatoes or watermelons or things that, you know, either was the extras from where they were working, or sometimes they were things they were growing themselves. A lot of farm workers I've noticed, you know, I mean, they're they're small farmers in a way, right? They don't own the land they work on, but they know the soil, they know how to grow things, and whatever little patch of land they might have, they're always growing things, and they give it to you, right? And it's always, like literally these are the people who feed us, but then when you go and help them, they give you some food,
Mm.
and I've always found that, and I know their kids, I know I grew up with the migrant farm worker kids. I ran the after school program in when I was in college at one of the migrant farm worker camps. So kids, I knew when they were 6 are now like 17, 18.
Mm.
And it's, I don't know. So I just find a lot of joy in that.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, I guess John Steinbeck.
Love that. Sounds like you find a lot of joy in community. Well, thank you so much, Antonio. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to seeing all that you do in the future.
Yeah, thanks. And likewise.